Hi, thanks for being here at this session in the extra cool theater down here. We were going to do these as a presentation in the round, but decided not to. So this is the no-see, no-touch traps. And we are talking about, so still struggling to escape or free at last. With scholarly publishing, we've moved into a space where we are able to take on more content that is outside of just the text, traditional text, but this also makes a more complicated landscape. Back in 2008, in the fall of 2008, we had a workshop at Microsoft Research on scholarly communication, and this was one of the first meetings where we really looked at scholarly communication across the spectrum, from beginning to track things in the lab to post-publication processes. And I think 8 years later, this is really developed. So with our group of people we have today, we are looking at these topics across the spectrum. So our first presenter is Neil Chu Hong, and he is talking about computational literacy as a solution. Now he's putting this on par with proper citation analysis, and he's hoping to help researchers to make their data more accessible to a wider audience, and he'll tell us more about that. Following Neil, we'll have Irene Pasquetto from UCLA. She'll be looking at using craniofacial research as a point of study to look at the cost and benefits of data sharing. While biomedicine has often set the trends for open access within publishing, their sharing of data has lagged behind considerably. So she'll be telling us about the cost and benefits of this. Our third presenter is Todd Vision from UNC. And over this time, we've seen a slew of resources curating primary scholarly outputs enable dynamic reaggregation of publication observations. So he's looking at the Phenoscape project as a subject, and he's going to tell us more about how we can get a complete picture of the original research, how complete a picture can we get through the original research through collaborative open systems. And then we'll have Chris Chapman from Pentandra, and he's really looking at if the publication is just a point within the life cycle of scholarship, what happens if we capture the entire story? So this is taking us in quite a different direction as far as capturing the whole process. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Dina Tafilderi, and she's going to be looking at addressing issues and documentation of lab methods. So as you can see, we're really talking, moving across the scholarly ecosystem, across the chain of the processes. So we will start with Neil, and then we'll hopefully have time for some questions and answers.
Thanks very much. So let's hope the technology works. So I remember when I was looking at the speaker note briefs for this, they said, be brief, 10 minutes. Let's see how I do with this one. So thank you very much. My name's Neil Chu Hong. I'm the director of the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK. And what I would like to talk about today is really around the idea of how can we make open access more accessible? So, quick show of hands, who thinks open access is awesome? Okay, who thinks open access isn't awesome? Yeah, there we go. So you know, we're from a crowd where we believe open access is the right thing to do. And indeed, it is amazing how many more pieces of data, how many more publications, how many more research outputs are all being made open access. But how many people here are aware of what open source is? Okay. Yay, this is easy. This is going to be easy. So one of the problems with open source is that just putting an open source license on a piece of software does not necessarily make it useful. In the same way, just making a publication, a piece of data, open access does not necessarily make it accessible. So we have this kind of weird thing where we love open access and we think it's awesome, and we make sure that everything becomes open access, and we drive all our colleagues to do this, we drive all our researchers to do this, but we still need to solve that accessibility problem. And there are many different pieces of that accessibility problem. As we've seen in kind of some of the talks from earlier today, one of the biggest problems is there's just so much research out there. So where do we start? The number of journal articles that are available on open access is going up steadily. The number of data sets that are being made up, data sets being made up, that are being made available, maybe they are made up, is also increasing rapidly. So what we have here is we have this problem of open access making things available, but actually putting a barrier in place of many people in terms of understanding it because they don't know where to start. And here we're talking about researchers. What I'm really interested in is how do we open all of this up for people outside of the traditional research sphere as well? Because what we're doing, essentially, is this. We are basically giving people the best public library in the world, and they're not providing them with a shelf map, an understanding of which library classification system they're using, and importantly, we're not giving them a really good librarian to ask questions of. So what we have is this huge corpus of information, and then not the tools and the understanding, and indeed the ability to make use of it. And the reason why this is important is because, again, as we've seen earlier today, actually, the public are interested in this. People are interested in things which intersect with their everyday lives. So here we have something like the Zika virus. People are interested in finding out more. They've heard it in the news. How can they get access to all of the wonderful things that we are providing to the research community themselves? So, what's the answer here? So I think there's basically three things that are the answer. First thing is metadata. So, metadata is a love note to the future. It's a love note to yourself as well. One of the things that we need to be able to do is make things more machine readable. And one of the aspects of this is being able to describe things in ways that actually computers can read, not just humans. So we've got this thing where we saw this gradual move and evolution through time of how scholarly communication has turned into something which has become very formalized. And ideally, that would make it much easier to machine read. But that's not the case. We put things into PDFs, which are hard to machine scan. We don't describe the meaning, the semantics of many things in a way that are readable. Indeed, we don't even make the licensing machine readable in many cases. So we don't understand how we can reuse the data. So that's one aspect of it. Second aspect is if it's not machine readable and you can't really understand how to search through the information, you can't really create good tools either. And this is one of the main vectors of getting information out to the public. So creating tools like the teams at My Society do with open data from UK government data, where people can ask questions that relate to what they're interested in. The map that's behind there is an example. It shows me all of the areas that I can choose to buy a house in so that it will be quicker for me to take public transport than driving to get to my place of work. So giving people the ability to ask these kind of questions of openly available data based on openly available models is the way to get engagement. And then lastly, it's about the literacy. So what we should be able to do is get to the situation where anyone, anywhere, is able to use open access publications, open data, and open tools to ask their own questions directly using open resources. And so you might get the case like we have here, an example of the use of a science gateway in the US, where someone from a high school has taken all of these different resources and created their own hypothesis, their own question, studying the spread of HIV. And the first time that any of these people knew that this work had been done was when the citation pops up in Google Scholar. So, how do we make it all awesome? How do we make open access awesome? We've got to be able to make metadata that makes things machine readable to improve the searching. We've got to be able to provide the tooling that allows people to use this data in ways that create their own stories, and we've got to be able to understand how we improve the computational literacy through things like software carpentry and data carpentry that make the analysis of all of this open access information available to everyone. Thank you very much. Six minutes.
Okay, hello everybody. Just 1 second. Okay, so my name is Irene Pasquetto. I'm Italian originally, and I'm a social researcher. And I study data practices in science. I'm specifically interested in question of making scientific data open, but even more specifically, I'm interested in understanding once this data is open, if we can reuse it, and how we can reuse it, why we can, why we cannot, under what circumstances. So I think this audience, as we have seen, is well aware of the potential benefits of making scientific data open, especially in biomedicine. And also we are, I think, pretty much aware of the possible socio-technical barriers that we can encounter while trying to make this data open, as the previous speaker just showed. What I'm not seeing much in the literature right now are question of, okay, once this data is made open, can we actually reuse this data? Who is reusing it? And as I was saying, under what are the circumstances, the factors that are allowing scientists to reuse this data? Okay, this is the research question I'm investigating right now. And in order to answer this question, I pick a case study, which is a consortium for data sharing, for making actually not just data sharing, but it's open data, to making biomedical data from the craniofacial community. So it's genetics and biology data available to the wider community. So a little more about this community. It's funded by NIH. And there are 11 projects all around the United States involved. We have clinicians, biologists, bioinformaticians, and informaticians that they work on this project. So we have 10 scientific spokes who are collecting the data. And then we have the engineers, informaticians who are responsible of making this data available on facebase.org. So I'm a social researcher, so I just want to tell you a little bit more about our research design. We do extensive document analysis, meaning that we analyze the grants documents, all the papers, the white papers, all the documents produced by the community. Then we basically follow the scientists in the lab and observe and take notes about what they do and how they produce and they share their data. And we do the same thing with engineers. And then we interview these people, and then we code our interviews. So this is about our method. Okay, some preliminary finding. What I'm observing is that there is a combination of factors that is actually making the reuse of this data pretty difficult, pretty challenging in this community. What is important to keep in mind is that these factors, they are not just one of these factors is complicating the use of this data, but it's the co-presence of all these factors together that is complicating the reuse of the data. So first of all, okay, not very surprising, the high heterogeneity of the data produced by the community. So as I was saying, we have 10 communities, 10 different projects, 10 different spokes, plus the engineering lab who is making the platform. Each spoke is producing data, not just different types of data, but also data related to different genes. So you can imagine that each of these spokes is working basically on a different gene, or 2 or 3 genes, but different within each other. And also this data differ by methods of data collection, and so you can imagine how this data is very heterogeneous. As a result of this high heterogeneity in the data, what is really difficult is to find the relationship among these data. And of course, we know that finding the relationship among these data is necessary to allow the reuse of data, because you need it in order to model the data, to organize the data in data models, and to allow then future scientists or the wider community to retrieve this data and reuse this data. Now, what is, I think, is interesting, at least for me, is that I'm realizing that the relationships among these data are not obvious at all. They are not obvious for the scientists, and they are not obvious for the engineers. And this is a fact that is not always well recognized, especially by policymakers, meaning that it seems like these data are created and they are shared out there, and then someone is going to find the relation and organize them. Actually, this is not an easy process. It's actually taking a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, hours of collaboration, communication that during long meetings between the scientists and the engineers to create these data models. And so this is the real challenge of this project. And so another factor that is complicating the reuse of the data is that this database is what I call the small data scale of the database, is the third factor. What I mean is that at least in this project, with this kind of data repositories, we don't have enough data to create, to allow actually for overlaps among this data. So we started with a project, but we actually didn't think through or enough about how these spokes were selected in the first place in order to allow enough similarities among the data, enough overlaps among the data. Yes, I forgot to say in my introduction to the problem that I just heard yesterday during a workshop a speaker saying that since 2007 NIH invested $1.2 billion in creating this kind of data repositories. So we also have a lot of funding in creating this repository. That's why I'm also interested in understanding, okay, once we created this kind of open data project, are people using it, and why yes and why not? So, okay, the last factor that is creating, that is challenging the use of the data is that it's very difficult to understand who are the real potential users of this repository. Why? Because this repository was created, this is what the grant is saying, right? For the wider community. Now, imagine you are an engineer and you have to build a data model, okay? And you have to talk with the people who knows how this data has to be related to each other. Okay, you have to talk with the wider community. Okay, I mean, who is the wider community? You don't know exactly who you are talking to. So, and this is really challenging the collaboration, because then the engineers, what they have to do, they have to go and ask the data contributors, the time spokes that we have seen before, how they want to reuse this data. But the time spokes, they don't know now how they want to use this data because of the factor that we have seen before, because there is not enough data to allow overlaps, and because it's very heterogeneous, the relationships are emerging, and so on. Okay, so if I could give some policy recommendation for next time that someone is creating a data repositories for opening biology data, what I would say, I would start with saying maybe we need to select a project that share interest in similar data in a way that can we lessen the complexity of the relationship between data, at least at the initial stage of the project. Then we can, open the data and the contribution to the wider community, but the project at least needs to work at the beginning. And then we have to select enough projects in order to allow for overlaps in the data, and also identify a community, a clear community of users, meaning give to the people who need to test this platform name and last name of, 50 possible candidates that they can talk to and they can test this platform with. And so this is it. I just want to thank you, my team from UCLA and our founder.
Hello, so I'm Todd Vision. I'm from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'd like to talk to you today about reaggregating primary research outputs. Again, it's a case study, and again, it's from the area of bioinformatics. The case study here is in trying to understand the value of curation, and some of the design choices that come in what I'll call reaggregating primary research outputs. In this case, information that's explicit in an article, but for human readers that in order to reuse in the way we want, it needs to be synthesized across studies. And it's a very common problem, and we've heard about it in various guises at this meeting. In particular, I want to talk about how we can maybe build up an evidence base that would guide, for example, funders who have to decide where to invest, what the scientific payoff is in curation versus other forms of innovation and scholarly communication. So the motivating metaphor is this wonderful one from Steve Pettifer about cows and hamburgers. And so imagine that the research as a whole is the cow, and it goes into this meat grinder, and at the end you have the homogenized, indistinguishable mass of meat that makes the hamburger, which may be very edible for the human consumer, but perhaps you're interested in the cow, or some aspect of the cow, or perhaps you're interested, in fact, in some aspect of lots of individual cows, and that would be, to stretch the analogy, trying to use data that's found in many different studies that needs to be synthesized before it can be taken advantage of. So there's kind of very crudely 3 strategies I'll talk about for how one might extract information that's found in lots of different studies that may be of value. And the first is exemplified by this wonderful paper from David Shanton's group from a few years back, Adventures in Semantic Publishing. This is actually a case where, after the fact, they took a paper and marked it up in a way that, for instance, the map data in the paper was georeferenced and machine readable. The citations were typed relevant to ontologies, so you knew how the other literature was being referenced. The keywords were marked up with ontology. So it's kind of a best case from a few years ago of how one could make a traditional article machine readable and semantically interpretable. And of course, there's been a lot of innovation and experimentation in this area in authoring tools and literate programming and repositories at the front end of publication to fix the issue of just embedding everything within a human-readable PDF so that it's no longer accessible to machines or synthetic research. Number 2 is curation, and we just heard NIH invests an enormous amount in data repositories, and much of that goes toward curation. This is an example from a survey of the International Society of Biocurators, so one particular discipline, of the kinds of objects that they curate. So maybe it's genes or proteins or pathways, but any data type which has a large biomedical audience is going to have some market there, some demand for curation of the literature, of information that's within articles into databases such as model organism databases. And the third strategy is text mining. And of course, text mining and curation can work hand in hand, and in fact, this image is from a paper about that. So here, the literature exists, and is there a cursor? Yeah. One can use text mining to triage the literature that one wishes to curate. One can extract entities from that literature. One can find relationships between those entities, such as genes or small molecules. One can annotate the evidence and the provenance of those statements and incorporate those into databases so that they can be used by others. So largely speaking, we have things that we can do at the front end, or kind of 2 different approaches at the back end. And we would like to have evidence that tells us how much work to invest in curation at the front end versus these other technologies, which are kind of, at the time of publication at least, they're cheap. So the project I want to talk about this in practice is Phenoscape. So it's an attempt to go into a scholarly literature which doesn't have this kind of high attention from NIH. It's like many scholarly literatures, it's maybe a little more introverted and a little more specialized. So this is sort of biodiversity phenotype data. We may be able to find relations between things that are changing in evolutionary history and the genes that are being characterized in model organisms like mouse and zebrafish and fly that can tell us that some genes may have been important in evolutionary history. Again, the ultimate aim is not biomedical, but there is, in fact, a scholarly community that publishes traditional papers. These phenotype data have been published in this form for decades and decades. And since we don't have a world in which everyone publishes structured, semantically marked up literature, it will take a very long time before we could ever do this unless we were willing to invest in curation or text mining with both legacy literature and the stuff that's being published today in traditional journals. So we don't really have a choice in the matter. We have to do one or the other, or some combination of the two. Just to give you a picture of what things look like, this is a phenotype quote from the evolutionary literature, so it can get very, very specialized. And so our challenge is to take a description like this, which I'm not even going to try to read, and to capture that in a machine-readable form, and what level of detail is necessary to make that usable in machine-readable form. I'm going to go very quickly over this image, which just shows a simple phenotype, both for genes at the bottom in the front gray box, for a taxon, so the evolutionary phenotypes we're interested in the back box, and the relationship to ontologies above them. So the level of detail can be broken down on whether we're just trying to extract the entity, which is on the far right, which in our case comes from Uberon ontology, or whether we're trying to capture attributes of that entity. This is the shape that's affected, or the size that's affected, and how much detail we want to use. So simply put, it's either curation at the entity level or curation more granular than that is what we're going to be able to compare. And we want to ask, are we able to match genes from naturally occurring biodiverse taxa with genes from model organisms and human diseases in a biologically meaningful way? And our test case will be this thing that everyone learns about in their college biology class, if you've had it, which is the transition from fins to limbs as tetrapods invaded land. And so there's really nice fossil data that tells us what some of these skeletal systems look like during that transition. And we have phenotypes curated for those fossils. And from the work of Kellen Mastick, we have hundreds of articles that have been curated so that we have the expert knowledge of what the candidate genes that have been proposed by developmental biologists are. So we kind of have the knowledge and the literature that we'd like to be able to recreate, just knowing the fossil phenotypes, just knowing the model organism phenotypes. So can we generate hypotheses that are realistic and useful? That's our test case. And so that the happy consequence is that overall we can. So I want to compare low granularity annotations of curation with higher granularity, or finer. So low granularity is just extracting the entities. There's no detailed description like you saw in that quote. The blue is the distribution of about 15,000 genes that aren't identified as candidates by experts in the literature. The orange are the candidates that have been identified by experts in the literature. And on the x-axis is the similarity that we can see in the semantic annotation. So we are getting some separation, and that's good. But even better, if we annotate, we curate at a higher level of granularity entities and attributes, we get even better separation between those. So it does appear that if we were to use this system, generate hypotheses to then go into the lab to test, we would actually get useful things out of it. So what do I take away from this experiment? And hopefully you do too, although this is very rushed. Aggregated scientific observations could be used to generate hypotheses that transcend the knowledge from any individual study. So we're talking here about hundreds of studies. For biodiversity phenotypes, text mining of the entities alone would have been adequate. That gives us some separation. But there's value from human curation beyond what text mining can do today. We can't capture all those relationships with text mining alone. That requires human expertise. And human curation is going to be necessary as long as this kind of valuable information is only reported in traditional literature, and that's going to be the case for years to come. So given current funder biases against curation, which many here are familiar with, we need more of an evidence basis on the scientific contributions of curation like this, and so very happy that the results turned out the way they did. Thanks.
Okay. Those were excellent. I wanted to take a step back and think about the open access movement and some of the if we go back and look at open access as we see it today, we're faced with these papers, and that's not what this talk is about. So if we ask the question, open access to what? If open access to papers, this is from a letter from Benjamin Franklin in 1753. You could call it the beginning of the open access movement. He says, "My thoughts, my dear friend, are many of them crude and hasty, and if I were merely ambitious of acquiring some reputation in philosophy, I ought to keep them by me till corrected and improved by time and farther experience. But since even short hints and imperfect experiments in any new branch of science being communicated have oftentimes a good effect in exciting the attention of the ingenious, you are at liberty to communicate this paper to whom you please." There's the permission there. "It being of more importance that knowledge should increase than that your friend should be thought an accurate philosopher." So there's in this, I feel there's a sense of urgency, and it's not about the paper, but it's about the knowledge. And he wants it shared so that people can, as many people as possible, can benefit from the knowledge that he obtained. And as we, as scholars or scientists, researchers, produce research output, is what we call it, are we thinking about how can I maximize, how can I help as many people as possible in the world to use this knowledge in the way they need to? Or is it so I can meet the requirements of my grant proposal and so I can keep getting money? Is there a way that we could do more? So open access to knowledge is really, to understand a piece of knowledge, we need to understand where it came from. Not as much so that the person that wrote it can receive credit for it, but so that we can understand the context in which the knowledge was created. And there are many different fields and many specific vocabularies and concepts that that knowledge is encompassed. But we need to have ways to take a piece of knowledge, to trace back how it came about, so that other people can learn, and so that they can then create new knowledge from their specific point of view. And then, so this is kind of a step. Right now, we have open access to literature. That's what we're talking about. The next step is open access to knowledge. Creating those, and a lot of those things may be based on what has been mentioned previously, the semantic relations and all of that is great, but we need a way to engage people in this knowledge work, and that's kind of the third step that I see in my vision of what where knowledge creation could go, and So Margaret Wheatley, she wrote a book on leadership, actually, not scholarship, but so what she is saying is in the traditional sense, we leave the analysis of data to the experts, and in the second paragraph, she says, it would seem that the more participants we engage in this participative universe, the more we can access its potentials and the wiser we can become. We banish the ghosts of this ghostly universe by engaging in a different pattern of behavior, one in which more and more of us are included in the process of observing what is going on and contributing our unique interpretations. So what we are... There's a lot to get there, and how do we get there? To this idea of many people engaging in knowledge creation and learning. There's so something that that we need to have as part of this transition to the machine understandable research that we've talked about is it's really a social environment where anyone can feel like they can not only have access to the literature, but have the ability to learn and engage with the experts, and we're a place where they feel safe. Anyone. Experts feel safe that their expertise is not going to be ignored or overturned or overruled by people that are louder than they are, and a place where the non-experts, the curious, can come and feel like they can learn at their own speed and participate in ways that they feel comfortable with. So this kind of idea is the scholarly commons, and it's taking a lot of the tools that we have, but it's creating new ways to interact with these tools and infrastructure to be able to engage people. So a big part of this in our research has been looking at the importance of questions and how we can bring and make questions a more integral and part of the research process. Questions invite participation, and they invite others of any skill level to ask and answer. I wanted to mention a little bit about the I'm not as much a researcher as I'm from the open source software community. So looking at the open source culture as a way, as a model of what the open knowledge community or the scholarly commons could be is really instructive. At the beginning of the open source culture, there was a lot of, like, open source was a religion, and there were a lot of religionists that would promote this stuff, but it was really hard to get involved on your own. So now with tools like GitHub and Git and other things, developers are able to interact in many different ways that are very easy. And that's what I hope to see in the scholarly commons. So this picture of a cat, it says the scholarly commons are best. But, okay, thank you.
We're missing one panelist, and I'm curious if she's appeared. And actually not. All right. Well, can we have all of our panelists come up here and take questions? Missing Todd. Where's Todd?
So, okay, cool. A lot of people talk about machine-readable systems, and that's quite a low bar in some. It's actually difficult. It's very difficult to do, but I'm very interested, as someone who works in AI, about the idea of machine-understandable and machine-reading systems, like machine intelligence applied to scientific data. Obviously, that's a whole order of magnitude more complicated, but I think given there are some people in the universe who are making robot scientists who can design and build their own experiments and do their own science, isn't that where we're going? So given what you've just talked about in terms of machine readability and data and how it all fits together, do you have any kind of aspirational, visionary views of how we can move what is necessary for us to move the process of doing science and gathering data towards the idea of machine, not just machine readable, but machine understandable and machine predictive science. So we can actually leverage AI technology to help us make predictions about what you get a whole bunch of data, and then you can actually have systems predict what it is we would like to see and what the experimental design would be for us to do that. Do you have any kind of visionary ideas for that kind of stuff?
Take that.
It's a really good question. I'm struck by the fact that one of the biggest challenges in science and research in general is actually each different discipline, and even within different disciplines, tends to talk with slightly different languages and vocabularies, and that's what makes research difficult across disciplines and also exciting. And one of the things, obviously, that there's been a lot of research that's come out of different areas of science, computer science, social sciences and so on, is understanding how we might ascribe semantic meaning to different terms to allow us to start bringing together some of the machine, I guess, describable vocabularies together so that we understand what different units are, what different concepts are. I think the way forward, though, is understanding that we are still all very different people, and individual disciplines are very different in the way that they deal with things. So being able to have a way of having all of these different schema perhaps interoperating rather than having one unified language for everyone is the way to go forward. In terms of kind of getting into the machine, I guess, generated research. That's really interesting. That's not something I know an awful lot about. I've seen some really intriguing projects where people are effectively trying to find new chemical structures through prediction, through guided prediction, trying to discover new inventions. So there's an interesting art project called All Prior Art, which is generating, based on existing patents, all possible new patents. But I think the real challenge there is understanding how we define what is a useful hypothesis. And that's where maybe, I might turn the question back to you and go, what do you think there? So.
One issue, I suppose, is the scale at which machine intelligence can operate, and so I wonder to what extent we're already seeing the emergence of systems that meet that idea, say in recommendation systems for scholarly literature, where there is enough data and it's structured and it's across disciplines and it's large. The kinds of, we're interested in machine intelligence within the project I described as well in Phenoscape, but there's no way that that's ever going to be at the scale that's needed for machines to really, extract beyond large-scale patterns of statistical significance that just emerge because of the scale of the data that's just not there. And I think there's probably a lot of scholarly and research questions that are in that meso scale where it may not emerge into the realm where machine intelligence is really going to take off.
If I could say a little bit, the approach that we've taken is with, instead of artificial intelligence, it's with augmented intelligence. So instead of having the computer figure out stuff, creating domain-specific software for each domain that understands kind of the culture and the vocabulary, so that as researchers are working, there's not a mismatch between the researcher and the software.
Do we have another question? Thank you.
Question for Todd. On your last slide, you had a point, and I don't quite remember the words exactly, but it was something along the lines of, as long as phenotypes are published in the traditional literature this way, we're going to be limited. But I wonder if you could just be a little more explicit about what your sort of vision was. So say I was going to publish a phenotype now, and I decided I wasn't going to do it in the traditional literature. I mean, what would you want me to produce? Would it be some sort of, RDF representation, or what exactly are you after?
Right. Well, so we could ask authors to use our curation tools to become experts in the ontologies enough to annotate their data to the form that we would want it. But then we do lose some granularity in those annotations, even if you take it to sort of the max that the ontologies will allow. The natural language allows for subtleties that are very difficult to capture by any annotator. And so even then, you'd want a bipartite system, right? You'd want to be able to get the full expressivity of natural language, and you'd want them to be able to submit it, in the way that we would curate it. But it's not feasible, really, to ask that of researchers at this point, and we don't have tools that are good enough to assist them to do so.
It's actually fascinating that you say that the natural language allows for all sorts of ambiguities, but nuance. And it sounds like that's a positive thing, because I feel like in general people develop ontologies in order to allow you to remove ambiguities and actually be more specific. So that's actually, that in and of itself is interesting to me. But we might talk more about that afterwards. Thanks.
We have any more questions? Surely there must be a question. All right.
It's more of a reply. In terms of software that helps people bridge the gap between building phenotype, phenopackets, as was presented this afternoon, on their own from nothing, from a text file. So we're working on helping to solve that problem with web phenodes. It's create.monarchinitiative.org, and we're in the early stages, and we would love to get community feedback on requirements and use cases. And then secondly, I would just agree with the bipartite system. We need both the nuance of natural language and machine-readable formats if we're going to serve both use cases. Unless, of course, we machine generate the natural language.
Thank you for that comment. How many people are using the types of processes that our panelists were talking about in their work that they do? It's not terribly many, a few. Is there, can you tell us what you're working with, or how? Just.
We actually started this, hi Golly, in response, in some ways, to the AI community, because we did want to get when we were coming up from the genomics field, so I hark back to the 90s and sequencing big genomes and trying to structure the data. And the AI people were interested then, but it was a little too complex, and we had more real-day everyday problems. So that was when we started the gene ontology, which was one of the very first ontologies, and which is now in OWL, and is still primarily used, as it once was, for enrichment analyses. I think the work that Todd showed where he showed the precision or the precision or distinctiveness of the annotations improved the separation in the data that he was analyzing, so that when you had crude annotation or coarser-grained annotations, you didn't get as clear a separation of the sets that were associated with, where you could associate the phenotype with the gene. But when he added more detailed information, the distinctions were finer. I do think that the communications is a spectrum, right? It's going to always go from digital to very fine, nuanced descriptions, and to be able to move easily across that full spectrum of communications is essential. And the more we can do to that, I think, though, there's a lot of work not to have a single overarching semantic ontology, but to have a suite of ontologies that can be put together. If you noticed when Todd was talking about phenotypes, it was actually decomposed into a number of separate ontologies. There was one for the entities, for the anatomy parts. There was one for the qualities of those. So you can, just like you can parse a sentence, decompose it into different levels. But I think making the data computable not only helps with the statistical correlations, but with also making it findable.
Thank you. No, that was for putting you on the spot. Thank you. Question from Chris?
I'd like to take us back to the more general set of issues for the panel around what open access really means. And all of you have acknowledged in some way or another how difficult it is. Could you each reflect on the amount of invisible work, the amount of human work that goes on behind the scenes to make open access possible?
Should I start? Okay. Well, from what I'm observing, at least in my community, the people who are actually collecting the data now, maybe this is one case study, it could be different in other fields, are usually also those that are expected to curate the data and are, but they don't have much time to do it since they are usually postdocs. So I at least in my community, it's not really clear who is supposed to curate the data and then make them structured in a way that is available. I was actually curious to hear how it is in other, who is exactly in charge of doing this kind of job. Then we also have the figure of the bioinformatician, who is to some extent again responsible for taking care of some parts of this process of curating data and making them available. But again, it's kind of, it seems like everybody knows that it needs to be done, but it's not really clear who is responsible of doing it. So.
I can say we have an estimate for about halfway through the annotation in the project I described, that it took about 5 person-years of effort between the ontology building and the data curation, and that was for about 500,000 individual phenotype annotations. So very large-scale human investment. No, many people.
I can reflect on that from from open source software. There are many open source software projects that are just volunteer, and a lot of them, and much of the web runs, or the internet even runs on these projects that people have just given time without compensation. And that I think is a problem, and it hasn't really been addressed completely to my satisfaction in the open source software community. And I think there's a level of motivation for people that want to help. That's good, but I think some of those the issues of how these things are could be sustained is useful for both communities, the software and research.
I think it is a big issue because in some sense we have this expectation that a lot of outputs will be at least minimally curated, and then they're not. So my background as well was in scientific software and research software, and one of the things that you might expect, for instance, is that we have an understanding of which software are developed on research funder projects. But certainly in the UK, that's not the case, because although there is increasingly a mandate to make these available and to make data available, we need to appreciate the amount of time it takes to create the records that go into the systems that allow people to search for these outputs when they are made available. And I think people underestimate the cost of this. One cost is in the creation of these different records. One example that we have is that we tried to run one of these catalogs for outputs of software, and it took about 2 staff members working full-time to keep up to date the outputs of around about 200 projects. So that's a significant staff cost for not very many projects. And on the other side, we are faced with the issue of trying to build infrastructure to allow people to do this. So again, we've just moved recently in the last month to requiring research-funded projects in the UK to deposit records of all of the data that they're producing. And yet, one of the problems we have is that a lot of the universities are still trying to build the infrastructure for this, and is taking up the teams that are the ones who should also be the ones helping that data to be ingested. So we have lots of hidden costs all over the place.
That's a really great question, Chris. I think the erasure of the labor is a huge thing here that we're really not acknowledging. And I think with the open projects in general, that tends to disappear easily.
Another challenge for funders to understand what the products of their funding are is that those funders are typically not providing well-identified grant numbers. So even if you're not able to build a master database of all of the appropriate, pristine, crystal clear metadata, you should have a sort of effectively a hashtag for your grant that you can put wherever it needs to be.
Let's take our last question.
Just following up what you said about hidden costs, I was really intrigued by your presentation about the hidden cost between technologists, engineers, and the science that they work with. And I was wondering if you had any further insights about how to make that cheaper, faster, better. I know you put some insights about whether or not you have the right users to start out with or the right groups to start out with, but let's say you don't, because we never do. So how do you make that communication better between those two groups?
Right. So this is exactly the focus of my research. Right now, the communication between the scientists and the engineers is very fascinating and challenging. And so it seems obvious, but make them talk to each other, that's basically the fundamental trick, which is not so obvious, especially when these collaborations are organized. Also, make them talk during meetings, organize like weekly meetings, and not just like formal meetings, but also like informal conversations. And then, even though I have to say that I witnessed some meetings during which the engineer is asking a question, the scientist is answering the question, and the engineer is like, no, I have no idea what you just said, can you? And then it's like, it takes just time. I think that both communities, they should just accept the idea that they are speaking different languages and put some patience in it, time, and this also has to be recognized by the funders, meaning that all this process of data modeling takes resources and time, and it's as important as the data collection process. So, yes, I mean.
I think one thing that we should have mentioned, it didn't, is the credit attribution, the taxonomy of the 14 different roles that was introduced last December, I believe, and hopefully that will make these roles more visible. But thank you all for coming to this session and enjoy. Oh, I have an announcement. The conference organizers would like you to fill out a survey, and they are due by tomorrow at noon, and you can fill this out online, or there are paper forms upstairs at the desk. And if you submit your form, you might win a prize. Thank you.